will need political correctness to fight that game, you know. That the creator of Hergé, the creator of Tintin, Hergé, always said that his dreams and his nightmares were in white. His nightmares were in white. But we know that the politically correct games of the future will be whites putting their hands up in the air, complaining because somebody's made a remark, complaining because they haven't got a quota, complaining because this form is biased against them, and this sort of thing. They'll be playing the game that minorities in the West play at the moment, because that's all that's left to them. You know, you're given a slice of the ghetto, you predefine the culture, mass, middling and elite, in the past, but not into the future. Elements of the culture that are too much redolent of your past don't serve for the future and are therefore damned off and not permitted. And this is what, in a sense, white people face in America and elsewhere. One of the great mysteries of the United States that's produced an enormous amount of this mass culture, some of which I've been at times rather glibly describing, is why has there never been a mass, serious right-wing movement of the real right in the United States? The whole history of the 20th century and before would be different if that had occurred. Just think of it. Not some sort of trivial group, but a genuine group. Don't forget, the real position of the American ultras is isolationism. They don't want to go out into the rest of the world and impose American neocolonialism on everyone else. They're the descendants of people who left the European dominion in order to create a new world. Hence the paradox that the further right you go in the United States, the more, not pacifist, but non-interventionist you become. Now, before the Confederacy, there was a movement called the Know-Nothings, which is, and this is often why very right-wing people in the United States are described as know-nothing. And because when you were asked about slavery, which of course was a very loaded and partial question, you said, well, I don't know anything about that. And that was a deliberate tactic to avoid being sucked into an abolitionist agenda or a way of speaking that was biased in the political correctness of its own era. But it is remarkable that although the Confederacy didn't have the strength to win, if they had won, the history of the whole world would be different. The 20th century would have never taken the course that it did. And one of the interesting things about the American psyche, of course, is that many unfortunate incidents, the war that we fought with the United States in 1812, for example, been completely elided from history. It's gone, it's gone. We almost went to war with them in 1896 over Venezuela, but still has slightly sort of interesting intonations even now, a century and more on, when Joseph Chamberlain was colonial secretary. This is again rather like the Suez incident in 1956. There are certain incidents that are played up and there are anniversaries that are every day on the television and that you can't escape from, but there are other anniversaries and other events that have been completely airbrushed from the spectrum and from the historical continuum, as if they never occurred. One episode is the extraordinarily bad treatment of prisoners of war by Americans. Going way, way back, the Confederates and the Unionists treated each other that way in the Civil War, but the Mexicans certainly got the boot in the 1840s, as did Spanish Cubans at the turn of the 20th century. Americans beat up every German on principle, including members of Adenauer's future cabinet, when they occupied part of Germany. They just regard that as de rigueur. And this frontier element that is there, crude and virile and ferocious, not always wrong, but ultimately fighting in ways which are not in the West's interest, certainly for much of the 20th century, just gone, is part and parcel of the heroic American sense of themselves. Where do all of these archetypes ultimately come from, the American popular culture, which has gone universal? Because the deal is that what America thinks today, the world thinks tomorrow. When we allegedly ruled the world, or parts of it, in the 19th century, Gladstone once stood in Manchester, in the Free Trade Hall, and said what Manchester thinks today, the world thinks tomorrow. But now it's what's on MTV or CNN today that the world would like to think is the ruling discourse of tomorrow. And American self-conceptuality is, to my mind, deeply, deeply Protestant, in every sense. And even at the lowest level of their popular culture, the idea of the heroic man, often a dissident police officer or a rancher or a hero of certain supernatural powers and so forth, but a man alone, a man outside the system, a man who's anti-establishment but who fights for order, a man who believes that everything's settled with a weapon, which is why they always carry large numbers of weapons, these sort of survivalist type heroes. All of these heroes, the ones created by Robert E. Howard, the ones such as Doc Savage, and Justice Incorporated and The Shadow, and all of the superheroes like Batman. Superman's interesting. Superman is Nietzschean ideas reduced to 1,000 levels of sub-intellectuality, isn't it? That's what's going on. He has a girlfriend who never ages, called Lois Lane, who looks 22 now, even though she's about 88, in the trajectory of the script. There's a villain who's bald and called Lex Luthor, who's always there, always the nemesis, always plotting. Luthor's reinvented later in the strip as a politician who takes over the city. Superman's clean and wholesome, you see, whereas the villain becomes a politician. You can see the sort of the rhetoric. Luthor and Superman in the stories are outsiders. They're both extraterrestrials. Luthor, however, has anti-humanist values, which means he's evil. Whereas Superman, who's partly human, has humanist values. Luthor comes out with amazing things, particularly in the 1930s comics, which are quite interesting, particularly given the ethnicity of the people who create Superman. Now, about half of American comics are very similar to the film industry. And a similar ethnicity is in the film industry as is in the comics industry. And part of the notions of what is right and wrong, what is American and what is not, is defined by that particular grid. Luthor's an ultra-humanite. Luthor has always these thuggish villains who have several teeth missing and are sort of Lombrosian. They're ugly and have broken noses and slanty hats. You know, this is the 1930s. And Luthor says, I'm sick of the human. He says, we've got to transcend the human. They don't have words like transcending comics. They say, go beyond or something. You know? We've got to go beyond the human. Humans have got to go! I've got to replace them with a new species. And one of his thugs will say, way to go, Luthor, this is what we want. Because if you notice, you have a comic called Superman. But Superman has liberal values and fights for democracy in the American way. And Luthor, although no one ever says, is fascistic, quote unquote. He's harsh, he's elitist, he's inegalitarian. You know that the villains always have a tendency to punish their own men? Remember Blofeld in the Bond films? One of his own minions will fail him, and he'll sit in a chair, and you know what's going to happen. The hand strokes the cat, you know, with the gold, with the diamonds round its neck. You know, the villain likes cats, you know, and the cat's eyes stare on, and the hand, the finger quivers over the button, and Blofeld or Luthor or Dr. Doom or the Red Skull or the Joker or whoever it is, because it's the same force really, says, you failed me. You failed me. There is only one punishment in this organisation. Click, the button goes and there's an explosion, the bloke screams, goes down in the chair. There's a great scene in Thunderball at the beginning where the chair comes up again that's empty and steaming. And all the other cronies are all readjusting their ties, you know. The bloke all sat there, and the camera always pans to his hands. The hands of power, you know, the hands of death, the hands of Zeus, the hands of Henry VIII, you know. The closet would meet, and they'd all be disarmed by guards, but he would have a double-headed axe down by the chair. It's said by American propaganda that Saddam Hussein once shot his Minister for Health during a Revolutionary Command Council meeting, and the same script had to be continued in the meeting by the Deputy Minister of Health. Just think how the Deputy Minister felt. Let's hope he wasn't wearing grey flannels, because they might have been brown by the end of the cabinet session, wouldn't they? But this idea of dualism, moral dualism, ultimately a deeply Christian idea in many ways, or also a Zoroastrian idea, is cardinal for the morality of these comics, and the popular films, and TV serials, and all their internet spin-offs, and all of these computer games. Because even when the hero's a woman, like Laura Croft and so on, it's the same methodology coming round and round again, because adolescent boys want to look at somebody who looks like Laura Croft as she runs around with guns in both hands and virtually nothing on, you know. And that's the sort of dissident archetype in these American pulps, going back a long way. It's just the feminisation of heroic masculinity, actually, which is what these sort of Valkyries are, in popular terms. Now, the dualist idea that there's a force for evil and a force for good, and we know who they are. They're the ones out there. In the Hulk is green, because he's affected by gamma rays. And the Hulk alternates with a brilliant scientist, but when he's in his monstrous incarnation, because of course it's a simplification of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in Robert Louis Stevenson's myth. And the Hulk is incredibly stupid.